That night, fire erupted from the very place Harper called home. Alone in her smoke-filled room, the 5-year-old blind girl couldn't see the way out. But through the crackle of flames and the panic of shallow breath, a figure burst into the fire. Not a person, but a dog. It bit into her shirt, dragging her inch by inch, breath by breath, toward the window. It didn't bark out of fear. It barked because it knew no one else would save her. And in that exact moment, that heartbeat between death and miracle, the fate of a child and a nameless dog was sealed forever. Before diving into this strange and moving journey, hit subscribe to catch more powerful emotional storytelling films from our channel. The wind over eastern Colorado in late winter is not just cold, it slices through skin like memory, through silence. The land here doesn't whisper, it groans. Dry earth, faded barns, telephone lines that hum like they're tired of waiting. Somewhere between nowhere and nothing, there's a one-story trailer house sagging beneath a sky smeared with ash-colored clouds. It looks like it's trying to disappear. Inside that house, a 5-year-old girl named Harper lives in a world without color, without shape, without light. She was born blind. Not the kind of blindness that comes from an accident or an illness. She was never promised sight, never teased with flickers. From the moment she left her mother's womb, she was plunged into a silence made of shadow. Harper doesn't cry about it. She doesn't know what she's missing. There are no memories of sunsets, no fading recollections of faces. Her world is sound, texture, temperature. She navigates by the way the floor creaks, by the scent of damp wood after snowmelt, by the weight of her mother's footsteps versus the dragging stumble of her father. There's no room for imagination when your entire reality is built on surviving the chaos of the present. Her mother, a woman whose hands are always full laundry dishes, worry moves like a ghost through the day. She doesn't speak softly. Every word she says is clipped efficient, as though she's measuring oxygen. Her face is rarely turned toward Harper when she speaks. There's always something else demanding her attention. Her father, once a mechanic, now a man, undone by stillness, spends his hours either asleep or angry. The local mine closed 5 years ago. He never found work again. The beer cans pile up behind the shed. Sometimes he mutters things to Harper, things she doesn't understand. But mostly he pretends she's not there. He doesn't hate her. He just doesn't know how to love her. And Harper? She spends her days in the small backyard. It's bordered by a half-broken fence and the humming of a distant highway. She knows the pattern of the fence posts by touch. The 3rd one has a nail sticking out. The 5th one leans to the left. These are her landmarks, her country, her universe. Every morning, once her mother stops yelling and the house settles into that dangerous silence, Harper walks outside with her arms gently outstretched, fingers twitching in the wind. She doesn't wear shoes unless it's snowing. She likes the way the ground feels cold, dry sometimes, muddy after rain. Her bare feet tell her stories no book ever could. There's a stump in the middle of the yard, the remains of a long dead tree. Harper sits there, often facing north. Not because she knows it's north, but because it's where the breeze comes from. The breeze, she says, has teeth. Some days it's biting. Other days it licks. She listens. That's what Harper does best. She listens to the world. Most children are distracted by what they see. Harper absorbs everything else. The shrill cry of a hawk 3 miles away, the way the wind shifts right before a storm, the ticking of a beetle inside a rotting plank beneath her feet. These are her maps, her melodies, her truth. But that truth is lonely. She doesn't go to school. The local district said they didn't have the resources. Her mother said they couldn't drive her. Her father said nothing at all. Harper didn't argue. She just stopped asking. Days blur together. Seasons pass with the changing sounds of birds. There are no birthday parties, no playdates, no toys, really. Her favorite object is a rusted wind chime that hangs from the porch. It sings to her in code. Some nights, Harper dreams of light, not because she's seen it, but because something in her hums for it. Not color, not shape, just the idea of something more than black. A warmth, maybe. A presence. But when she wakes, it's always the same dark, silent static. She talks to herself sometimes. Or to the wind, or to the bugs. Not in full conversations, but in fragments. Whispers. Hopes that don't have names yet. Her voice is soft, unsure, like a candle flickering in a storm. One particular afternoon, Harper stands motionless in the middle of the yard. The sky is gunmetal gray. A storm is teasing the horizon. The air feels charged like something important is coming. Her mother's inside yelling at the oven. Her father's asleep on the couch, snoring with the kind of violence that speaks of drowned ambition. Harper tilts her head. There's a sound she hasn't heard before, a low rustle, deliberate, not wind, not bird. Her body stiffens, instinct taking over. She doesn't run. She never runs. She listens. There it is again, closer. Her tiny hands curl into fists. Her bare feet dig into the soil. She senses something on the edge of her world, just outside the border of her known reality. Something watching her. Not with malice, not even with curiosity. Just being. And for the first time in a very long time, Harper doesn't feel entirely alone. She doesn't speak. She doesn't move. But her heart is no longer slow and indifferent. It's awake. Alive. The space around her crackles with potential. She doesn't know it yet, but everything is about to change. Inside the house, her father stirs. A bottle clinks. Her mother slams a drawer. But Harper doesn't hear any of that now. All she hears is breathing. Not hers. Something else. A presence. A heartbeat in the wind. The first whisper of fate. Under a low and angry sky, the wind began to turn sharp. The first drops of rain didn't fall. They stabbed. It was one of those Colorado nights that wrapped itself around everything like a warning. The kind of weather that made animals dig deep or disappear. But not this animal. Not tonight. Harper stood barefoot on the edge of her world, the crumbling back steps of her family's trailer. Her head tilted upward, unseeing, but every inch of her body was listening. The rain came harder now, soaking the wooden railing beneath her fingers. Somewhere behind the shed, near the stretch of gnarled wire fence that led toward the junkyard, there was movement. She could feel it before she could hear it. A presence, a weight in the air. Then softly, just barely audible between thunder groans and the creak of rusted metal in the wind, came footsteps. Not the lazy shuffle of a drunk or the heavy drag of her father. These were different. Quiet. Deliberate. 4 legs. Paws on wet gravel. Then a pause. Harper's lips parted slightly. Her breathing slowed as if silence might draw it closer. And it did. A moment later, something brushed against her ankle. She didn't flinch. It was wet, cold, alive. The smell hit her neck's damp fur rot, something metallic like old blood. It should have frightened her. Her mother had told her all strays were dangerous, diseased, wild. But Harper didn't move. She felt known. The creature at her side wasn't barking, wasn't growling. It was still, waiting. The rain began to pour harder. Behind her, the porch light flickered. Her mother opened the door. "Harper, what the hell are you doing out?" She stopped short. Oh my God. Get back inside now. Harper felt the creature jerk as the screen door slammed. Her mother's voice was sharper now, angry and afraid. "That thing is filthy. Get away from it." Harper turned toward the voice, but she didn't step back. Instead, she whispered, "It followed me." Her father appeared behind her mother, beer bottle in hand. He squinted into the dark eyes, narrowing. "Damned mutt. Looks rabid. I'll shoot it if it comes back." The words hit Harper like a slap, but the dog, if it was a dog, didn't run. It just stood beside her, silent, still. Her mother grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. The door slammed shut again, and Harper stood in the entryway, dripping, fists clenched. "You are not to go near that thing again, do you hear me?" her mother snapped. "It could be sick, diseased. You have no idea where it's been." Harper didn't reply. She didn't need to. In her mind, the moment had already carved itself into something permanent. That silent shape in the rain, that patience, that sense that for the first time in forever, someone or something had come for her. The next morning, Harper opened the front door without a word. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. Mist clung low to the ground, like it was trying to hide something. The air was cold, brittle, but not as sharp as the night before. And there it was. Lying curled just off the porch, its fur matted and crusted with mud, was the dog. Or wolf. Or ghost. Harper didn't know what to call it, but it was waiting. Not sitting, not watching. Waiting. She stepped forward slowly, knees trembling not from fear, but from the weight of recognition. The creature lifted its head. It didn't wag its tail. It didn't make a sound. It simply stood stretched and took a step forward. Toward her, Harper crouched low, reaching out. Her fingers found fur, coarse, wet, tangled. And beneath it, the rhythmic thud of a heart. "You came back," she whispered. Behind her, the door creaked open again. Her mother's voice, weary and immediate. "Harper, I told you, leave it be. That thing's dangerous." "No, it's not," Harper replied quietly, not turning around. "It's kind." Her father's voice cut in from the kitchen. "I'll call the county if it's still there by noon." But it was still there. Not just by noon, not just that day. It never left. It didn't enter the house. It seemed to know the rules. But every morning, it was waiting. Every evening, it followed Harper back to the steps. Every time she stepped into the yard, the creature appeared beside her, silent as shadow. It never barked, never begged for food, but it watched over her like it understood something no human in that house ever could. Harper began to test it. She walked further each day. At first only to the shed, then to the edge of the junkyard path. Then beyond the fence to the cracked remains of a concrete slab where something once stood. Every step the dog was with her. If she veered toward the broken barbed wire, it would gently nudge her back. If she turned toward a ditch or the old well, it blocked her path. And somehow she always listened. Not because it commanded her, because it respected her. She gave it a name in her mind, Shadow, because that's what it was. An echo beside her, a presence just out of reach. Her mother noticed first. How was she not tripping over everything anymore? She murmured one day, watching Harper trace a perfect path through the uneven yard. Her father scoffed. "She's memorized it. Routine, that's all." But it wasn't routine. Harper had never stepped so confidently before. Never smiled, really smiled when outside. Never tilted her head in that strange knowing way that meant she was listening to something deeper than sound. One afternoon, Harper stood in the center of the yard. Her eyes, those unseeing pale blue mirrors, were fixed straight ahead. Shadow stood beside her. She whispered, "Go left." The dog moved. She whispered again, "Now right." It moved again. She was playing a game no one else could see. A dance without music. Her father watched from the window, beer in hand. That damn dog's teaching her tricks now. But he didn't say it with anger. He said it with fear. Because deep down, something about this wasn't natural. It wasn't taught. It was known. That night, her mother sat on the edge of the bed. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. "Where did that dog come from?" "Harper?" Harper shrugged. "It found me." "Why do you think it stays?" Harper thought for a long moment before answering. "Because it's lost too." There was no answer to that. Only silence. And outside, beneath the bruised sky of another approaching storm, Shadow lay curled on the porch, waiting. Harper would never see the flicker in her mother's eyes as she stood in the kitchen the next morning, watching her daughter step confidently across a landscape of danger, led not by sight or sound, but something older. Something instinctive. It wasn't just a dog anymore. It was a compass. It was a key. And Harper, she was learning to walk towards something she'd never known. Possibility? Harper had never known the word freedom, but now she could feel it pressing against her skin like sunlight filtered through clouds. It started small. One morning, she stepped out onto the porch barefoot as always and made her way across the yard without touching the wall to guide her. Her toes brushed familiar patches of dirt, the grainy edge of concrete, the slightly raised groove in the earth left by last month's rainfall. She didn't trip. She didn't hesitate. She just walked. Shadow moved beside her, quiet as dusk. No leash, no spoken commands, just presence, just trust. Harper stopped when she felt the worn wooden stump beneath her fingertips. She circled once, then sat down. Perfectly aligned. No fumbling, no guesswork. As if the world once scrambled and threatening had been redrawn into something soft and knowable. She reached out a hand. Shadow's coarse fur met her palm. They didn't speak. They never did. But they understood. Inside the house, her mother paused at the kitchen window. For a moment, the rag in her hand stopped scrubbing the already clean counter. She squinted through the glass, watching her daughter, her blind daughter, navigate an uneven yard as if she had eyes in the soles of her feet. She watched the animal at Harper's side. The way it moved just ahead, then stopped, then angled itself as if drawing invisible lines in the air for the child to follow. It unsettled her, not because it was wrong, because it was impossible. Harper, the same girl who once clung to doorframes and flinched at shadows she couldn't see, was now moving through space like she had access to a code the rest of them had lost. At night, Harper whispered to the dark, not to herself, to Shadow. Her mother listened once through the cracked bedroom door. Harper's voice was low, almost reverent. "I don't need to see you," she said. "I hear you." There was silence. Then a soft rustling fur against cotton sheets, nails gently tapping the floor. "You breathe like rain," she added. "That's how I know you're close." The mother stepped back into the hallway and closed her eyes. Something ancient twisted in her chest, something she'd buried under years of exhaustion and fear. She didn't understand what was happening between the girl and the animal. But it was real, tangible, and growing. Harper began to name her surroundings, not with visual markers, but with sound. The old sycamore was the whistler. The cracked tire swing was the yawner. The busted propane tank, the hummer. Every object in the yard earned its identity from the noise it made in wind, rain, or silence. And then there was Shadow the guide, the bridge, the keeper of rhythms. The dog had become her reference point. One soft grunt meant turn left. 2 sniffs meant something in the way. A single bark barely audible meant stop, and she always obeyed. It was more than obedience, though. It was intuition sharpened by proximity. A 6th sense born of necessity and trust. Shadow became the drumbeat to which Harper danced. And Harper, so small, so still, became a conductor of movement without ever raising her hands. The father didn't say much. He never did. But he noticed the change. He'd open the fridge to find less beer, realize he hadn't shouted in 3 days, then glance out the window and see Harper walking the fence line, that dog flanking her like a shadow stitched to her feet. Sometimes he'd even sit outside on the broken lawn chair with a cigarette burning between his fingers, watching the pair trace invisible paths across the yard. He didn't believe in magic, but this felt close. Harper gave the dog a name one morning, as frost still clung to the blades of grass. She reached out, scratched behind his ear, and said it clearly. "Shadow." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. It was simply true. He was the thing that followed but never demanded. The protector who asked for nothing. The shape that filled the space between danger and her. From that moment on, Shadow was more than a stray. He was myth, guardian, mirror. One afternoon, the wind picked up. The kind of wind that shakes loose rust from nails and makes screen doors slam without warning. Harper stood in the middle of the yard, listening. The air spoke in layers, distant trucks' crows, spiraling above the faint jingle of a collar she never attached. Shadow made a low sound. Harper turned sharply. That way. He nudged her leg once. She smiled. Together they walked, past the propane tank, around the whistler, toward the place where grass gave way to gravel. Harper hesitated there. Shadow did not. He moved forward, then circled back, waited, moved again. She followed, step by careful step. And when her foot found the edge of the broken stone path, she didn't stumble. She adjusted, as if she knew, as if she could see. Later that night, her mother stood in the doorway of Harper's room. The girl was asleep, her tiny hand curled in Shadow's fur. The dog's eyes opened, but made no sound. Just watched. The mother swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. She whispered, "You're not just some dog, are you?" Shadow blinked once, slow, steady. The house was quieter these days. Not in that empty way silence sometimes brings, but in the way of still waters, deep, thoughtful alert. Harper didn't cry anymore. Her father didn't rage. Even the television stayed off. Something invisible had wrapped around them. A spell. A presence. A truth too large for words. Harper began doing small tasks without help, finding her cup in the cupboard, setting it gently beside the sink. She knew when the stove was hot. She stopped knocking over chairs. Her mother tried to brush it off. She's just growing up, getting used to the house, but that wasn't it. The child was evolving, not into someone new, but into the person she was meant to be before the world taught her to be afraid. Shadow, always at her side, was the difference. Not a crutch, not a tool, a partner. One morning, Harper stood barefoot in the frosted yard, face tilted to the pale sun. She turned slowly, as if tracking something invisible across the sky. Her mother watched from the steps, arms folded tightly. Harper spoke, voice firm. "Shadow says it's going to rain." The woman looked up. The sky was clear. She opened her mouth to protest. But 2 hours later, the rain came. And in the hush of its falling, the mother wept. Not out of sadness, out of something older. Recognition that her child, the one born into darkness, had somehow found light, carried not in her hands, not behind her eyelids, but beside her heart. 4 paws, 1 soul, and an unspoken language only they understood. The sun that day was sharper than usual. No warmth, just glare. It washed the dry earth of the Colorado plains in a faded gold, the kind that made everything look like a memory. The town hadn't seen a visitor in weeks, maybe months. No one came here unless they had nowhere else to go. So when the old beat-up Ford pulled into the corner gas station and a man with a faded brown coat stepped out, heads turned. Not because he was dangerous, but because he didn't belong. Not anymore. He walked with a limp, slow and deliberate. A canvas bag slung over one shoulder, a rolled-up folder tucked under one arm. The patch on his coat had worn away, but you could still make out the shape of a caduceus, the staff of Hermes. He was a vet. Not just for animals either. Dr. Conrad Walker, retired military veterinarian. 30 years of scars and silence. He was passing through, headed north toward Montana. But the gas pump was slow and the wind was rising, so he wandered. That's when he saw the dog. It was lying in front of the hardware store, half in the sun, half in shadow, minding its own business, watching a small girl across the street. Watching the world with the kind of patience only old souls carry. Walker stopped. For a moment his breath caught in his chest. Then he stepped forward, knees cracking gravel, crunching under his boots. The dog stood, not because it was afraid, because it recognized something. Walker crouched slowly. His voice, when it came, was soft, gentle. "Well now, where the hell did you come from?" He extended a hand, not to pet, but to observe. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it moved closer. Walker's fingers brushed the fur, coarse and thick. His hand slid to the neck, feeling beneath the layers of mud and dust. That's when he felt it. Scar tissue. Not new, not from a fight. Clean, circular, like the ghost of something that used to be there. His brows furrowed. He leaned in, whispered more to himself than to anyone else. "You wore gear." The dog blinked. Walker stood slower this time, his eyes scanning, ears tilted slightly, just listening. Then he called out, "Whose dog is this?" No one answered. Harper stood across the road, her hands resting on the top of a low fence, Shadow just a few feet from her. Her head tilted not toward the man, but toward the shift in the air. "Shadow," she asked softly. The dog turned instantly and trotted back to her side. Walker followed. The closer he got, the more certain he became. This wasn't a stray. This wasn't luck. This was training. He stopped a respectful distance from the girl. "You the one who found him?" he asked. Harper's mother came out of the general store with a bag of flour and saw the exchange. Her voice was sharp, a mother's reflex kicking in. "Can I help you?" Walker raised both hands. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare anyone. I'm just curious about the dog." She looked down at Shadow, who stood at attention beside Harper. "He showed up a few weeks ago. Wouldn't leave." Walker nodded slowly. "He's trained." The mother raised an eyebrow. "Trained, guide dog, service animal, no doubt in my mind." She shook her head. "That's not possible. He came from the junkyard." "I don't care if he came from the moon," Walker said. "That dog has seen things, been taught things, and he remembers." He stepped forward, careful not to spook either of them. "I'm a vet. Worked with the Army K-9 units. I've handled dogs like this my whole life. You don't forget what they look like." Harper spoke quietly. "He listens to me." Walker smiled. "I bet he does." He crouched again, motioning toward Shadow. "Mind if I—" The mother hesitated, then nodded. Walker examined the dog's stance, calm, balanced, alert. Not aggressive, not submissive, just ready. His fingers found the scar again. He wore a harness once, he murmured. Maybe a collar with GPS. Hard to say. Could have been military, could have been civilian. But someone trained this dog to lead, and he hasn't forgotten. He stood and looked at the mother. You said he came from the junkyard. She nodded. Any tag chip? We didn't check, didn't think. Walker pulled a small scanner from his bag. It was old, scratched, but still worked. He waved it near Shadow's neck. Beep! He froze. The screen lit up with a faint string of numbers, but no owner ID. No registry, just a frequency. Walker frowned. That's odd. What is it? The mother asked. It's a chip, but it's blank. Wiped. Either whoever trained him didn't want to be tracked, or they lost him, and the data expired. He stared at Shadow again, this time, with something more than curiosity. Something like awe. There's a story here, he said softly. And it's buried under more than just dirt. Harper reached down and touched Shadow's ear. He finds me in the dark, she said, even when I don't call him. Walker nodded slowly. Yeah, he would. The wind shifted. A dry gust sent dust spinning down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a crow screamed once and was gone. Walker exhaled. Listen, he said, turning back to the mother. I don't know where this dog came from, but I know where dogs like this usually end up. He looked at Harper. And I know who they were meant for. He reached into his bag and pulled out a weathered manila folder. Handed it to her. What's this? She asked. List of canines decommissioned over the last 5 years. Some went to shelters, some vanished. She flipped through it, pictures, names, serial numbers, dogs with human eyes and broken paths. He pointed to one entry. This one. Tango, Black German Shepherd mix. Assigned to a blind veteran who died 3 years ago. Dog went missing in transport, never found. Harper's hand tightened around Shadow's fur. The mother shook her head slowly. You think this is him? Walker's voice dropped. I think some dogs are made for more than one mission. They stood there for a long time, the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled. Eventually, Walker tucked the scanner back into his bag. I'm headed north, got folks to see. But if you ever want help getting him registered or checked out, let me know. He scribbled a number on a piece of cardboard and handed it over. Then he looked at Harper one last time. Keep listening to him, he said. I do, she replied. Walker turned and walked away, limping back to his truck. The engine roared. The tires kicked dust into the sky. And just like that, the vet was gone. But something had been left behind. Not a fact. Not a name. A question. Who was Shadow? Where had he been? And why, out of all the children in the world, had he found this one? No one had the answer. But Harper didn't need one. She already knew. Every morning now began the same way. Before the sun had stretched fully over the Colorado plains, before the kitchen faucet groaned to life, and before her father lit his first cigarette of the day, Harper and Shadow were already outside, waiting, walking, listening. The yard was no longer a field of obstacles. It was a language. And Harper, guided by paws she couldn't see, and instincts she never asked for, had learned to read it fluently. The crunch of frost beneath her soles. The subtle shift in wind when a rabbit darted through the brush. The whisper of pine needles brushing against each other in hesitation before a storm. It was as if the world had always been speaking, but only now had Harper found the ears to hear it. She didn't use a stick. She didn't hold a rope. Shadow was her compass, and she followed without doubt. There was no hesitation in her steps, no fear of where she might land. Shadow anticipated her movements before she made them. If a loose rock shifted near her feet, he angled his body subtly, and she responded with ease, adjusting her stride, shifting her weight. Their movements were synchronized, like breath and heartbeat. It wasn't just a partnership, it was communion. And for the first time, Harper laughed. It wasn't loud, it didn't echo, but it cracked through the silence of the house like lightning through a midnight sky. Her mother heard it from the sink. She froze. Water overflowing from a chipped mug, her hand trembling. It was a sound she hadn't heard in months. No years. A child's laugh. And not just any child, her child. Harper, who used to cry at every doorframe. Harper, who used to cling to her pant leg at the smallest creak. Harper was laughing in the cold. Outside, the wind picked up. Shadow barked once low and brief, and Harper turned her head to the left. "Got it," she whispered, stepping around a puddle. The dog wagged its tail. That afternoon, Harper approached her mother with a request. "Come with me." The woman hesitated. "Where?" "Just walk." Her father grunted from the corner of the room, flipping through the same newspaper he never read. "She's going to get herself hurt." But the mother set down the dishcloth and nodded. "Okay." They stepped outside. Shadow was already waiting. Harper didn't reach for her mother's hand. She just walked, and the woman followed, past the propane tank, past the bent fence, across the dirt patch with the stubborn root. Harper didn't stumble once. Shadow never looked back. The sun was strong that day. It cast long, sharp shadows across the broken path as they moved further from the house than Harper had ever gone. The wind carried the scent of pine and the faint trace of smoke from someone's distant chimney. At the edge of the property stood a line of old trees, thick, tangled, wild. No one in town had reason to go there. Beyond them was a slope that dipped toward an empty creek bed. Harper stopped. Shadow sat. The mother stood still, eyes wide, heart pounding. How did you know where to stop?" she asked. Harper smiled, facing the trees. "The leaves change their sound here," she whispered. "They stop rustling and start breathing." It made no sense, but it made perfect sense. The woman looked down. Her daughter's feet were dusty, but sure. Her chin held high, not in arrogance, but in certainty. Something broke open inside her. Tears uninvited and hot rose fast. She wiped them away roughly, as if ashamed. But Harper turned her head toward her mother. "Are you crying?" "Yes," the woman admitted, voice cracking. "Why?" "Because I didn't know you could walk this far." "I didn't either," Harper said. "Until he showed me." She bent and wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck. The dog closed its eyes. They stood there for a long time, just breathing. When they returned to the house, the father was waiting on the porch. He'd seen the whole thing from the top step, coffee in hand, a cigarette half burned in his mouth. He didn't say anything, just opened the door wider. That night, as the wind rattled the window frames and coyotes yipped in the distance, Shadow stepped inside the house for the first time. He didn't rush, didn't sniff around like most dogs do when welcomed into a home. He simply walked to the corner of Harper's room, turned 3 times and laid down. There was no protest from the parents, no warnings, no resistance. It was as if he'd always belonged. Harper slept deeply that night, her chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the quiet breath of the animal beside her. In the darkness, her mother stood in the doorway again, watching. This time she didn't close the door. She let it stay open just a little, letting the hallway light cast a sliver of gold across the room. Like a crack in a wall, one that wasn't ready to break just yet, but no longer needed to hold everything in. The next morning, Harper emerged from her room dressed and ready before anyone else had spoken. She poured her own bowl of cereal, set it gently on the table. Her father, mid-sip of black coffee, stared. She sat down. "Do you think Shadow could come to the front yard today?" she asked. No one argued. After breakfast, she opened the door. Shadow was already there waiting. The day unfolded like something holy. By noon, Harper had navigated the rocky path along the side of the house. By evening, she'd found her way to the broken swing set and sat on it silent and still, her hands gripping the cold chains like they were the reins of some ancient beast. The wind picked up again. Shadow barked once. She stood and walked back inside. No stumbles, no fear, just purpose. From then on, Shadow wasn't just allowed in the house. He was part of it. Her father started setting out a bowl of water near the back door. Her mother kept an old towel near the threshold to dry his paws on rainy days. No one said these things out loud. They just happened. A shift, a surrender. A quiet agreement that whatever this dog was, wherever he came from, he wasn't going anywhere. Because Harper wasn't just surviving anymore. She was growing. And they weren't just a family anymore. They were learning to follow the girl who had no sight but more vision than any of them ever dared to claim. And she followed the dog who had no voice, but spoke to her in wind and heartbeat and breath. Shadow had found her in the dark, and now, somehow impossibly, she was bringing them all into the light. The wind that night carried a different sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of dry weeds or the hollow moan of winter through broken fences. It was low, heavy, pregnant, with something unsaid. In the stillness of a dying Colorado winter, the stars were muted, buried under clouds that felt too close to the ground. The kind of night that made even silence feel like it was holding its breath. Inside the trailer, everything had been quiet for hours. Harper was alone. Her mother had rushed to her sister's house after an urgent call, something about a fall. Her father begrudgingly had driven her, claiming he'd only be gone for an hour. The heater was humming louder than usual. It always did when the temperature dropped this low. Harper had curled up in her bed, wrapped in 2 blankets, Shadow at her feet. She wasn't scared, not with him there. Shadow had become more than routine, more than a guardian. He was instinct in animal form, present patient, always alert. His ears moved constantly, catching sounds long before any human could register them. His chest rose and fell in slow rhythm like waves Harper couldn't see, but could feel through the mattress. And then he froze. 1 second his body was relaxed, heavy against the bedding. The next he was up, rigid, ears pointed forward, hackles raised. Harper sat up, blind eyes wide. "What is it?" she whispered. Then she smelled it. Gasoline, no. Something else, metallic, bitter, sharp, and the heater stopped humming. There was a click, then a roar. The blast wasn't cinematic. It was close, violent. The kind that doesn't knock you off your feet, it throws you into a different reality. A fireball erupted from the hallway heater, swallowing the narrow corridor in seconds. Flames danced like they'd been waiting, licking the thin walls, clawing toward the ceiling with a fury that defied logic. Harper screamed, but no one could hear her. The windows trembled. The smoke came fast, thick, chemical choking. Shadow was barking now, a sound Harper had never heard from him. Not a warning, not fear, a command. "Move!" He lunged at the bed, grabbing Harper's blanket in his teeth and pulling. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air was too thick, her lungs burned. She curled into herself, instinctively reaching for something, anything. Her hands found fur. "Shadow," she gasped. He pulled again, harder. She tried to stand, but the floor was vibrating, the walls already weeping with fire. Her room was a trap, a box of smoke and heat sealed from the world. No way out. She stumbled, fell. Shadow circled back, nudged her ribs, bit gently at the hem of her shirt. He was leading her. She didn't fight it. Crawling, coughing, she followed his body. Her fingers locked in his tail, her knees burning from the heat of the floor. The door was engulfed in flames now. There was no hallway left, and then a rush of cold air. "Window!" Shadow lunged at it, front paws up on the frame, barking, howling, feral, primal loud. Outside the trailer park was quiet. Most of the neighbors had long since stopped looking out their windows at the Buckland place. But on this night, a woman across the gravel lot saw something through her blinds. An orange glow, smoke curling from the roof, and a sound desperate, hoarse, wild. A dog's bark. She screamed for her husband. By the time the sirens began wailing in the distance, the flames had breached the kitchen, dancing across countertops like a celebration of destruction. Inside the bedroom, Harper was pinned against the wall, the smoke pushing into her lungs like punishment. She couldn't cry, couldn't scream, only feel. Shadow pressed against her, his body a barrier between her and the worst of the heat. Then crash. The glass behind them exploded inward as the window finally gave, and just beyond the broken frame air, Shadow barked again, louder. 2 more times, and then Harper felt hands. Rough, fast human hands. A firefighter pulled her through the window, shouting something she couldn't understand. Her ears were ringing. Her skin stung. Her eyes useless, though they felt like they were bleeding. And then she was outside. Cold, snow, mud, voices, sirens. But no Shadow. "No," she screamed. "He's still in there." The firefighter turned, saw what she meant. A shape in the smoke. Still barking. Still inside. 2 men ran for the front, axes swinging. Another shattered the porch door, flames belching into the night air like a monster's laugh. Minutes passed like lifetimes. Then movement. A limp figure draped in ash and firelight carried out in strong arms. Shadow, still breathing. Burnt fur, blood. Soot in his eyes, but alive. Harper reached out, blind and frantic, and then they were together again. She buried her face in his side, ignoring the smell of smoke and blood sobbing into his scorched fur. "He saved me," she kept repeating. "He saved me." The paramedics wrapped her in a thermal blanket oxygen mask, pressed to her face. Her parents arrived moments later, horror painted across their expressions, running through the wreckage like broken ghosts. They tried to thank the fire chief, tried to make sense of what happened. But it wasn't the first explosion caused by an old propane heater in this town. Just the first where the survivor wasn't saved by a man, but by something wild, something loyal, something from the dark. Shadow was rushed to the emergency vet clinic 40 miles away. Harper refused to stay behind. She rode in the back seat, wrapped in blankets, eyes closed, hands shaking. When they got there, the technician looked doubtful. Third-degree burns, smoke inhalation. He's strong, but the words trailed off. Harper didn't hear them. She was kneeling beside the table, whispering into Shadow's torn ear. "You don't get to leave me," she said. "I haven't finished listening yet." And somehow, as the anesthesia took hold, Shadow moved his paw, just enough to touch her fingers, just enough to say, "I hear you too." The hospital hallway smelled like bleach and burnt nerves. Nurses moved fast, but quiet, their eyes trained to hide urgency. The aftermath of the fire had left more than smoke in Harper's lungs. It left questions, fractures, an invisible shift that had just begun to ripple through everything. Harper lay in the pediatric ward, wrapped in a white blanket that felt too stiff, too clean. The oxygen tube made her nose itch, but she didn't complain. She was quiet. More quiet than usual. The world outside had gone still. Her ears searched for Shadow's breathing, but he was 3 floors below in the emergency animal trauma unit, fighting for his life under a different kind of fluorescent light. Her mother sat beside her bed, eyes red, fingers clutching her phone without purpose. Her father paced near the door, speaking into a cup of lukewarm coffee. Then came the knock. A young doctor stepped in, thin, balding, overworked. He cleared his throat and smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they're about to say something that changes lives. "Mr. and Mrs. Buckland, I wanted to talk to you about Harper's condition." The mother stood. "Is she?" "She's stable," he said quickly. "She's incredibly lucky. No permanent lung damage, minor burns. But that's not why I'm here." He glanced at Harper. The girl stared past him with those pale, blank eyes. "We've been reviewing Harper's medical history. Her blindness is congenital, as you know, but she qualifies for a very rare procedure." The father frowned. "What kind of procedure?" "A corneal transplant, both eyes." The mother's breath caught. "We were told that wasn't possible." "It usually isn't," the doctor said. "But advances in ocular grafting, especially in young children, have progressed significantly. And more importantly, a compatible donor has just become available." Harper blinked. "Donor." The room turned silent, thick. The doctor sat at the edge of the bed. "A man in Montana passed away late last night. His corneas were harvested and entered into the donor network this morning. Perfect match. We received the alert less than an hour ago." The father rubbed his jaw. "Montana?" "Yes," the doctor nodded. "A retired Army veteran. Lived alone, no family. His medical records show he lost his vision in combat, but recent treatment had partially restored it before his death. He registered as a donor years ago." Harper spoke softly. "What was his name?" The doctor glanced at his clipboard. "Raymond Hollis." The name hit the room like a dropped anchor. No one spoke. But the mother sat down slowly, her hand trembling now for a different reason. She remembered that name, not from their town, not from the hospital, from the folder the stranger left behind. The one with the faded photo of a black shepherd and the man who trained him. The one called Tango. She reached into her bag and pulled it out, her fingers flipping through the pages until she found its serial number service log photo. And there he was, Raymond Hollis, retired Army specialist, blind, handler of service dog Tango, status deceased, dog missing in transport. The mother looked at her husband. "It's him," she whispered. "It's Shadow's handler." The father stared at the photo. "Jesus." The doctor looked between them, confused. "I'm sorry, what's going on?" Harper sat up straighter. "That man, he trained Shadow." The doctor's brow furrowed. "I don't follow." The mother handed him the folder. "Shadow's a military dog, service trained. He belonged to this man. Somehow, he found his way to us." The doctor's hands were shaking slightly now as he flipped through the document. "This is highly unusual." The father scoffed. "You think?" But it wasn't sarcasm in his voice. It was awe. The doctor looked at Harper. "You understand what this means, don't you?" She nodded. "He's giving me his eyes." The room fell still again. She wasn't wrong. 2 floors down, Shadow was undergoing surgery to remove infected tissue and close the worst of the burns. The vet had said he might never walk the same, might never recover fully. But he was fighting. Fighting like he had something left to protect, like there was one last mission, and it wasn't over yet. Upstairs, Harper curled deeper into her blanket. Her mother sat beside her again, wiping her eyes. Her father looked at the doctor. "What's the risk?" "With any transplant," the doctor began, "there's rejection. But this is a near-perfect match. If the surgery is done within the next 48 hours, the odds of success are incredibly high. And if we wait," the doctor hesitated, "there won't be another opportunity like this. It could be years. Maybe never. The father looked at Harper. What do you want? She didn't hesitate. I want to see him, the doctor asked. She turned her head toward the wall where she imagined Shadow was sleeping, breathing, surviving. My dog, my friend. The mother leaned over and pressed her forehead to Harper's. Then we say yes. The doctor stood. I'll schedule the surgery. As he left the room, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty. It was sacred. Downstairs, the vet finished suturing Shadow's wounds. The nurse whispered something about sedation and recovery time. But the vet wasn't listening. He was looking at the dog's eyes. They were open, and they weren't just eyes. They were watching, understanding, waiting. Harper would spend the next few hours in preparation blood work scans, a flurry of hospital procedures designed to make her body ready for something her soul had already accepted. When they wheeled her into pre-op, she held tightly to a piece of cloth. Shadow's collar, burned, torn, but real. The doctor looked at her one last time. Are you ready? She nodded. I already know what light feels like, she said. He blinked. You do? She smiled. It sounds like him. The night before the surgery, the hospital room was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The waiting kind. The heavy kind. The kind that hangs in the corners like steam after a scalding shower. Thick, invisible, impossible to breathe through. Harper sat upright in her bed, the blankets pulled tightly around her, as if she could cocoon herself from the decision looming over them all. Around her, machines blinked with quiet indifference. Monitors tracked the rhythm of her heart, her oxygen levels, her pulse, each beat of her body echoing a question none of them could answer. Should they do this? Should they risk it? Her mother stood near the window, arms crossed, staring at the city's distant lights like they held answers. Her father paced again. He'd worn a trail into the linoleum, his boots scratching faint arcs across the floor tiles. And Harper just listened. She didn't know what light was. Not really. She'd never seen a sunrise, or the blue of a bruise, or the way fire flickers in a reflection. Her world was built on sound, on touch, on instinct. She didn't understand color. She understood texture. She didn't understand sight. She understood presence. So how could she miss something she'd never had? How could she fear it? How could she hope for it? That was the real fear, not the surgery, not the risks, not the pain. It was the not knowing what to want. If she opened her eyes and the world was wrong, would that ruin the rightness she had built? Shadow wasn't in the room. The doctor said he was recovering, sedated. They had shown her pictures, Burns' healing eyes alert. But pictures meant nothing to her. She wanted to hear him breathe. That was how she knew he was okay. Her mother spoke softly from the window. We don't have to do this, baby. You're already perfect. Her father added, voice thick, but if you want to, we're here. Harper tilted her head. I'm not afraid, she said. They both looked at her. Then why are you so quiet? Her mother asked. Harper's fingers fidgeted with the corner of the blanket. Because I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. People say light is beautiful, but I already have beautiful. She paused. Shadow is beautiful. The way he walks with me. The way he stops before I fall. The way he breathes beside me at night. That's beauty to me. Her father's throat tightened. But if I can see him, Harper whispered. Really see him? Then maybe I'll understand what you all mean when you talk about stars and snow and smiles. Her voice broke just slightly. Maybe I'll finally know what it means to see someone love you. Her mother was crying now, no longer bothering to hide it. The decision was made. The sun hadn't risen when they wheeled her into the surgical suite. The lights above the operating table hummed with sterile energy. The air was too cold sharp with antiseptic, and the echo of footsteps trying not to sound like panic. The surgeons stood like ghosts in blue. Masks, gloves, a choreography of precision. Harper's body was small on the table. Her arms, tiny and pale against the stark white sheet, trembled slightly as the anesthesia line was prepared. The lead surgeon leaned close. Harper, can you hear me? She nodded. Do you want me to count you down? No, she whispered. He smiled beneath the mask. All right, sweetheart. Just think of something peaceful. She didn't think of waves or flowers or anything they'd taught her in therapy. She thought of fur, of warmth, of breath against her cheek in the middle of the night. She thought of Shadow. Then nothing. The anesthesia took her fast, deep silent. Monitors beeped, machines whirred. The surgical team moved like clockwork, their hands steady, voices low. Corneal transplant surgeries are delicate, timed. The donor tissue must be handled with reverence. There's something unspeakably sacred about transplanting sight. It isn't just medical, it's metaphor. A man who once saw war and loss had donated the last piece of himself to a child who had never known color. The first incision was made. On the observation floor, Harper's parents waited, fingers interlocked, not because they needed comfort, but because they needed to keep each other from unraveling. Minutes stretched, then hours. The nurses gave updates. She's stable. They've begun the graft. The tissue is taking. Each phrase landed like a breath they didn't know they were holding. Inside the OR, the team moved with reverence. The moment the second cornea was grafted, the energy shifted. Something sacred had crossed from death into life, from silence into potential. The surgeon whispered, "That's it." They sealed the sutures, checked the pressure, monitored for rejection. Harper's body remained still, but her pulse was steady, alive, accepting. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise. It was soft gold, bleeding into gray. The first light of day stretching across the Rockies. In the waiting room, Harper's mother stood as the doctor appeared. "She's in recovery," he said, his voice careful. "It went beautifully." The father exhaled a curse under his breath, relief knocking the air from his lungs. "She'll wake soon," the doctor continued. "There may be pain, swelling, but the graft took. It's strong. And if her body accepts it, she'll see." The word hit like thunder. "See?" Not maybe, not possibly. "See?" They were allowed in 2 hours later. Harper was sleeping, eyelids swollen, but wrapped in clean gauze. Her face was pale, lips dry, but she was breathing steadily. They stood on either side of her, watching, waiting. Then movement. Her fingers twitched, her nose wrinkled, and then she spoke. "He's here." They froze. "He's not barking," she added. "But I feel him." They looked around. Shadow wasn't there, still in recovery. "Baby, that's just the anesthesia," her mother began. "No," Harper whispered. "He's coming." And down the hall, as if summoned by something older than memory, the sound of paws on linoleum echoed like a heartbeat. Shadow, limping but alive, turned the corner. He walked slowly, wrapped in bandages, but with eyes blazing. Harper's gauze-covered lids fluttered. The moment was coming, and it would not be made of light. It would be made of truth. The first thing Harper felt was warmth, not just on her skin, but inside her. It bloomed slowly like morning through frost-covered glass. The world around her was still soft like a dream, just out of reach. She didn't know how long she had been asleep. Time had always been measured in sounds and silences, in footfalls and wind. But this awakening felt different. There was no pain, only weight. A slight pressure behind her eyes, as if her skull had been holding its breath and was now slowly exhaling. She didn't speak at first. She listened, always she listened, to the quiet hum of machines, the soft rustle of someone shifting in a chair nearby. Her mother's breath shallow and uneven. Her father's fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against something plastic, probably a cup. She knew these sounds, had lived in them her whole life. But something else was there now, something new, something bright. It wasn't color, not yet, not shape or image or clarity, but light. She could feel it even behind the gauze still wrapped around her face, like a whisper, pressing gently against her eyelids. She stirred. Her mother sat upright. "Harper." The girl turned her head toward the voice, her throat dry. Her lips parted. The first word she spoke was not mom, not dad, not where am I. She asked, "Where's Shadow?" The room went still. Her father stood. He's just outside, sweetheart. They didn't want to bring him in until... "I want him," she said softly. The doctor, standing at the edge of the room, exchanged a glance with the nurse. A nod. Quiet footsteps disappeared down the hall. Harper lay back, hands clenched gently on the sheets. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't afraid. She knew he would come. She always knew. And then, like the arrival of something holy, the door creaked open. The sound of padded feet on tile. A low chuff of breath. A rustle. Then pause. Shadow was in the room. Harper didn't need to see him to know. She felt it in her chest, in the change in the air. She turned her head slowly toward the sound. Her mother moved beside her. "They're going to remove the gauze now, okay?" Harper nodded. The nurse stepped forward, careful fingers peeling away the layers of white cloth that had guarded her new eyes for the past 48 hours. Each strip felt like a breath, like peeling back time itself. The room dimmed. The overhead lights were softened. The blinds were drawn just enough to let in natural morning glow. Finally, the last layer fell. Harper blinked. Once, twice. Everything was blurry, like trying to look through water. Shapes, motion, a brightness she couldn't name. Her brain fought to make sense of it, this sensory data she'd never received before. The nurse stepped back. The doctor leaned in. "Take your time, Harper. Let your eyes adjust." Harper didn't say anything. She was trying to translate light into meaning. Then a movement, low, close, slow. She looked down. Something dark moved at the edge of the bed. 2 eyes. Not human, not sharp, but deep, rich, knowing. And suddenly the blur focused. She saw him, shadow. His face burned in patches, fur uneven, one ear bandaged. But his eyes were whole, and they were looking straight into hers. For a moment, everything stopped. The room faded. There were no monitors, no voices, no machines. Just her and him. She inhaled, staggered. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, not from fear, from recognition. "I see you," she whispered. The dog tilted his head. She reached out her hand, trembling. Shadow stepped forward, placing his chin gently in her palm. Her fingers curled around his muzzle, and she felt the vibrations of his breath, the soft heat of his skin, the trust in his stillness. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I see you," she said again, voice shaking. "But I always did." Her mother covered her mouth with one hand, her body trembling with silent sobs. Her father turned away, pretending to fix his jacket, his face a storm. Harper smiled through her tears. "You were always light," she said softly. "I didn't need eyes to find you." She looked up, blinking more confidently now. The room was still a haze, but it was starting to come into focus. Her mother's shape, her father's shoulders, the sunlight filtering through the window, catching in the dust particles like a dance. But all of that faded in comparison to the first thing she saw. Shadow's eyes. Eyes that had watched over her, protected her, led her through a world she could only feel. Now she could feel and see, and what she saw was love. "He's beautiful," she said aloud, as if she were describing a miracle. Her father sat beside her now, placing a calloused hand on her leg. "You both are." The doctor smiled quietly and made a note on the chart. But even he couldn't hide the wet shimmer in his eyes. Harper lay back again, still looking at Shadow. "I thought seeing would be loud," she whispered. "But it's quiet, like the way he breathes." She pressed her hand gently to her chest. "I always knew he was taking me somewhere," she said. "Even when I didn't know where." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He was taking me toward the light." Shadow laid his head on the bed, eyes still locked on hers. And in that sacred, silent moment, a blind girl who had never known color stared into the eyes of a dog who had never needed words to teach her how to see. And finally, the world made sense. The following morning arrived with a hush, like the world itself was still trying to believe what had happened. Outside Harper's hospital room, snow had begun to fall slow, delicate, as if time were shedding its skin flake by flake. The white light spilled through the narrow window and touched everything with reverence. Dr. Keller arrived just after dawn, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night, clipboard in hand, heart caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. He stepped into the room with the quietness of someone entering a sacred space. Harper was sitting up now, alert, her eyes freshly bandaged again after the first post-op exam. Her mother sat at her side, her father in the corner with his head lowered in prayer, something he hadn't done in decades. And Shadow, faithful even in injury, lay beside her bed, bandaged and weak but alert. His eyes never left her. "Good morning," Dr. Keller said softly. Harper turned toward the voice. "Morning." Her mother stood. Is the graft still holding?" The doctor smiled. "Better than expected. No signs of rejection. Her body's accepted the corneas completely." Her father stood up now, jaw clenched to hold back emotion. "So she'll see." "She already is," Keller said. "But it's more than that." He stepped closer to the bed, pulled a chair beside it, and set the clipboard down. He took a long breath before speaking again. "We received more information from the Montana Donor Registry this morning. I thought you might want to know." Harper sat still, eyes closed behind the gauze. "The donor," he continued, "was Raymond Hollis. We already knew that. Retired U.S. Army, lost his vision in an IED blast in Afghanistan 2009. Spent the last years of his life in partial darkness." The mother nodded slowly. "And he was the one who trained Shadow?" "Yes. He was blind during most of the training. That's what's extraordinary." Keller glanced at Shadow, then back at Harper. "It's almost unheard of," he said. Blind handlers don't typically train guide dogs. They're trained with the help of professionals, sure but direct instruction that takes precision, timing, spatial awareness. And yet Hollis did it. Not only did he train Shadow, he taught him to lead. Harper tilted her head slightly. How? Keller smiled, almost sadly. According to a few notes from his VA caseworker, Hollis never gave up. Even when he couldn't see, he studied terrain maps, memorized obstacle courses, ran drills with other handlers using only sound and feel. He used verbal cues and a kind of rhythmic tap system. His body became the message. Shadow became the answer. Silence fell like snow again. And now Keller said, voice thick as eyes, "Are yours?" Harper didn't speak for a moment. Then quietly, "Oh, so I'm seeing through the eyes of a man who couldn't—" "Yes," her mother whispered. Her father stepped forward now, voice raw. "A man who gave you what he never had?" Harper reached down, fingers brushing Shadow's ear. "He was never really blind," she said softly. They all looked at her. I mean, maybe he didn't see things the way most people do. But he saw Shadow. He saw how to teach him, how to send him forward. He saw with his soul. Tears welled in her mother's eyes. Harper continued, "He made Shadow into eyes. And then Shadow brought me here. He gave me back what I never had." Dr. Keller wiped the corner of his glasses. "That's one way to look at it," No, Harper said gently. "That's the only way." She turned her head slightly, eyes still hidden, but gaze somehow sharp. Shadow was his vision, his courage, and now, he's mine. Her mother knelt beside her. "You're not scared?" Harper shook her head. "I was never afraid of the dark. But now I know it was never empty. It was full. It just wasn't light yet." Outside, the snow kept falling. Dr. Keller stood and cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." They turned to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Yellowed, sealed with a faded military insignia. This arrived with a donor report. Apparently, Mr. Hollis left it with his caseworker to be given to whoever received his donation. They didn't expect it to be a child. The mother reached for it, but Harper lifted her hand. "I want to hold it." Keller handed it to her. Harper felt the texture worn, edges deep creases. Her thumb found the raised insignia. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single note handwritten. "To the one who sees through me, don't waste a second chasing sunsets. Follow the things that bark and bleed and break. They'll teach you everything you need. The dark isn't your enemy. It's your classroom. Now go find your light. R8. Harper read it aloud slowly, her voice trembling. When she finished, no one said a word. Shadow let out a soft sigh. And Harper, still holding the letter, whispered, "He knew." Her father sat down hard in the chair across from her. "Knew what?" "That I wouldn't need his eyes to understand what he gave." She turned to Shadow again. "He gave me you. And for the first time since the fire, since the surgery, since the gift of vision was placed into her skull and stitched with hope," she began to cry. Not because of sadness, not because of pain, but because the thing she had never seen, had never touched, had never known until now, was gratitude. Deep, whole, blinding. Shadow lifted his head and leaned into her palm, and as her fingers found the warmth of his muzzle again, she said what no one else in that room had the courage to say aloud. "You were his eyes before you were mine." And the room exhaled, because they all knew that was true. In the spring that followed, everything looked the same to the outside world. The same dirt road led to the same weather-worn trailer on the edge of the same forgotten town in Colorado. The wind still scraped dry whispers across the fence posts, and the pine trees still bowed at the edges of the fields, as they always had. But inside the Buckland home, the world had shifted. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Harper woke each morning before the sun, just as she always had. But now when she opened her eyes, the ceiling above her wasn't just ceiling, it was light. Faint gray, soft-edged at first, then warming, bleeding into gold. The world came to her now in waves of color she hadn't known to crave. They didn't overwhelm her. She didn't chase them. She simply let them arrive. But what moved most wasn't what she could see. It was how she remembered what it was like not to, and that memory was her anchor. The day she first walked into a classroom, hand in hand with her mother's shadow limping loyally at her side, every child turned to look. Some stared, some whispered, but Harper didn't flinch. She stood straight, chin lifted, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she understood what it meant to finally see. The teacher knelt beside her. "Do you want to sit in the front?" Harper smiled, a little shy, a little proud. "I'd like to sit by the window." She didn't explain why. She didn't need to, because now she understood why windows mattered. Each morning she practiced letters. Her fingers traced the curve of a C, the slant of a K, the hard edges of an E. But what amazed her most wasn't the shape of things, it was their meaning. She had learned to read emotion long before letters. She could tell when someone was smiling without hearing it. She could tell when someone was lying without seeing their face. Now, with books and blackboards and chalk dust swirling in shafts of light, she was adding language to the intuition that had always lived inside her. And Shadow, he followed her still. Not with the swift, tight stride of a military dog in his prime, but with the slow, faithful gait of a warrior at peace. His hips ached now. His eyes, though sharp, blinked more slowly. His movements were more deliberate. But he was never far. He waited at the classroom door during math lessons. He curled beneath her desk during story time. At recess, he'd nap in the shade near the fence, while Harper sat cross-legged in the grass, telling stories to a half-circle of children. Stories not of fairies or dragons, but of darkness, of how sound can be a map, of how hands can see, of how a dog old and broken and beautiful had taught her how to follow silence until it became song. She told her classmates that the world doesn't begin when your eyes open. It begins when your heart does. The children didn't always understand her, but they listened. And that was enough. At home, her mother laughed more now. She cooked full meals, sang softly while stirring pots left the window open even on cold mornings. She wore earrings again, and perfume. Little things. But they mattered. And her father. He hadn't touched a bottle in months. He'd shaved his beard, found work at a local auto shop, and spent Sundays fixing what could be fixed. The truck, the broken gate, a long forgotten swing that he rehung from the oak tree out back. But more importantly, he listened. He listened to Harper read. He listened to her hum. He listened to the way she said Shadow's name like it was scripture. Some nights, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and just watched the wind move through the fields, grateful that silence no longer meant emptiness. It meant peace. Harper had been given the gift of sight, but she had already known how to see, and that difference became her gift to others. One night after dinner, she stood in the living room holding a small journal. "I want to write a book," she announced. Her parents looked at each other. "What kind of book?" her father asked. "A book for people who are still blind," she said. "Even if they have eyes." Shadow curled beside the couch, let out a soft, contented huff. Her mother stepped forward. "What will you call it?" Harper smiled. "The Eyes That Led Me." She didn't need permission, only paper and time and memory, because every word she would write came not from what she saw, but from what she remembered feeling when she couldn't, when the world was touch and voice and the quiet rhythm of pause guiding her across dirt and gravel and fire and fear. The world thought the miracle was the surgery, the restored vision, the light behind her eyelids. But the truth, the deep, quiet, irrefutable truth, was that the miracle had 4 legs and a scar on his side and eyes that never looked away. And even now, as he grew older, slower, softer, Shadow remained what he had always been. Not just her dog, not just her protector, but her eyes. Then, now, always. And as the spring wind danced through the cracks in the porch, carrying dust and pine and distant thunder, Harper sat down beside him, her head resting gently against his shoulder. She didn't close her eyes. She kept them wide open, because now she could see. But more importantly, she remembered what it meant not to. The hall was quiet, in the way only sacred spaces can be, heavy with memory, stitched together by silence. Rows of chairs lined the floor in neat, respectful order. On the far wall, projected in soft light, was a single image, a black and white photograph of a man in uniform. Raymond Hollis. Eyes clouded by time, posture, rigid mouth, neutral. Not smiling, not frowning, just steady. A man who had seen more than most and said less than all. In front of the screen was a simple podium draped in the faded flag of his unit. Beside it, a single empty chair left intentionally for the one who never returned. And just behind that chair, sitting tall despite the gray in his muzzle and the tightness in his joints, was Shadow. The audience was made up of veterans, some young, most older. Some in wheelchairs, some missing limbs, all of them carrying a weight too invisible for metals to measure. Their faces bore stories, but tonight they weren't here to tell theirs. They were here for hers. Harper stood backstage, hands clasped around a folded sheet of paper. She didn't need it. She'd memorized every word. but the act of holding something helped steady her. She wore a plain navy dress, her hair braided back, and a thin chain around her neck, bearing a single silver tag, the one that had belonged to Shadow back when he was known only as Tango. The MC, a former Navy pilot with a voice like thunder, finished reading her introduction. And now it's my honor to welcome someone who has carried light where there was once only dark, who speaks not just for the ones who've fallen, but for the ones who lead us home. Applause rose like a tide, quiet at first, then full swelling with something deeper than admiration. It was reverence. Harper stepped onto the stage. Each step was slow, deliberate, not out of fear but respect. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. She walked with the certainty of someone who had been led across fire and never once been burned. She stood at the podium, unfolded the paper, then placed it gently down, and looked up, eyes bright, steady, alive. I never met Raymond Hollis. She began, her voice clear but soft. But his eyes are in my head, and his dog is at my feet. A ripple moved through the room. She paused. I was born blind. Not blind like him mine was from birth. I didn't lose my vision. I never had it, which meant I didn't know what light was, or color, or faces. I didn't know what it meant to see someone and understand what they were feeling just by looking at them. She smiled, small and honest. But I did understand love. I understood fear. I understood the sound of a heart breaking through a wall of silence. Shadow shifted slightly behind her, his head lowering to rest near her heel. And then one day she continued. A dog walked out of a junkyard and into my life. Laughter, soft and brief, rippled again. I didn't know then that he wasn't just any dog. I didn't know he had already served someone else, that he had already been someone's light. She paused, eyes traveling the room. I found out later that Shadow, his name used to be Tango, had once belonged to a man who was blind from war. A man who didn't give up even when the world tried to convince him he was done. A man who trained his dog to guide him when he couldn't see the road ahead. She took a breath, and then, when he was gone, the dog found me. The silence deepened. I didn't have to teach Shadow anything. He already knew. He had already learned how to lead someone who couldn't see. He had already learned what love felt like in the dark. She swallowed, her voice starting to tremble. Shadow carried 2 lives in his chest, 2 missions, 2 people, one through the smoke of war, one through the silence of childhood. She glanced down at the podium, then back up again. I had surgery last year, a transplant. I can see now. Not perfectly, not all the time, but enough. A long pause. And when I opened my eyes for the first time, the first thing I saw was him, Shadow, staring at me like he had always been waiting for me to arrive. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. My parents say the miracle was the science, the doctors, the surgery. But I know better. She turned slightly to gesture toward Shadow. The miracle is him, a beat, and the man who built him. She pointed now to the screen where Raymond Hollis's face looked down like a sentinel of quiet dignity. He gave me his eyes, yes. But more than that, he gave me a path. He showed me that sight isn't the same as seeing, that courage doesn't have to come with sound, that healing doesn't wait for permission. She leaned forward slightly. I never met Raymond Hollis, but I walk with him every day. She folded her hands. And I want to leave you with something. He wrote something he left for me. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn scrap of paper. Her voice was lower now, tender. Don't waste a second chasing sunsets. Follow the things that bark and bleed and break. They'll teach you everything you need. The dark isn't your enemy. It's your classroom. Now go find your light. She folded the paper again, then looked up one final time. Shadow guided a blind soldier through war, and then he guided a blind girl through silence. We both walked out the other side, together. She stepped back from the podium. The lights dimmed slightly, and in slow motion, the camera caught her turning toward the photo on the screen. Her eyes, his eyes gleaming with quiet fire, locked onto his image. A pair of borrowed eyes, seeing for the first time, honoring the last, and giving the world something it hadn't seen in a long, long time. Hope. The forest had changed. It was quieter now, older. The wind moved slower between the trees, brushing through the branches like it too remembered things. Time had softened the sharp edges of the place, but the soul of it remained the hush beneath the pine needles. The hush Harper had once only felt, but never seen. She was 10 now. Taller, steadier. His eyes had adjusted to the world, but she still walked like someone who remembered every inch of the earth before it ever revealed itself. She stepped carefully over roots that once tripped her, her fingers brushing the bark of trees as if to greet them. Her shoes crunched softly on the worn path, and overhead sunlight filtered through the canopy in slow golden ribbons. The path was the same one she used to dream about when she couldn't see. It had been just a shape in her memory, then a ghost stitched together from sound and instinct. Now it was real, tangible, and somehow still magic. She stopped at the edge of a clearing where the underbrush broke into soft moss and filtered light. "Shadow," she called gently, not loud, never loud. Her voice wasn't a question, it was a ritual. There was a pause, a long one. Then from the brush came a sound familiar, slow and unmistakable. A figure emerged. Shadow, older now, his muzzle nearly white, his gait stiff. But he was there. His eyes still sharp, still searching for her. His ears twitched, and as their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. She dropped to her knees. "Hey, boy," she whispered, smiling. Shadow took slow steps toward her, every joint protesting, every breath deliberate. But when he reached her, he nuzzled into her shoulder as if no time had passed. She pressed her face into his fur, her eyes shut, remembering the first time he found her, in this very forest. "I came back," she said softly, "like I promised." Shadow let out a low exhale, warm against her neck. Harper pulled back just enough to look into his face. The years had not been kind to him, but they hadn't taken his spirit. That spark was still there, smaller, yes, but fierce. Present. "I'm older now," she told him, "but I still need you." Shadow's tail thumped once. She stood, brushing off her knees, then held out her hand. "Come with me." He hesitated for a breath, then placed his paw beside her boot. They began to walk, together. The trail wound through the trees where the sun filtered down in streaks so bright they almost looked painted. The deeper they went, the brighter the forest became, not with color, but with clarity. Every shadow had a shape now. Every leaf had its place. Every sound had a source. And Harper moved like someone walking through memory. She narrated the forest aloud, not for herself, but for him. The tree with the broken branch is still there. Shadow gave a soft grunt of acknowledgement. "The rock you used to leap over? It's covered in moss now." She glanced at him. "We'll go around this time." They reached a small hill where the trees parted, and before them stretched a wooden bridge, old, narrow, weather-worn, but still standing. It arched gently over a creek bed, now swollen with spring melt, the water glinting like a mirror catching the breath of the sky. Harper paused. This was the bridge, the place she used to imagine crossing when she still lived in darkness. In her mind, it had always led somewhere sacred. Somewhere beyond what could be felt. A place for endings, or maybe beginnings. She looked down at Shadow. He looked up. Together they stepped forward. The bridge creaked beneath them, a sound that felt less like strain and more like memory, unfolding itself board by board. Halfway across, Harper stopped. The sun pierced through the treetops directly ahead, spilling onto the far end of the bridge like a path drawn in light. The wind picked up, and for a moment the air felt weightless. She turned to Shadow. "I used to wonder what this would look like," she said. "I used to dream of it." He sat down beside her. "But the truth is, I never needed to see it." She looked ahead. "I just needed to know you were beside me." Shadow leaned against her leg. She knelt again, touching her forehead to his. "You found me in the dark," she whispered. "And somehow you taught me how to walk toward the light." Her voice cracked slightly. "You always did." A bird sang somewhere in the canopy above its call, echoing through the trees like a hymn. The water below moved in shimmering spirals, catching sunlight and tossing it skyward. Harper stood again. "Ready." Shadow rose. They walked the last few steps side by side until they reached the end of the bridge. There, bathed in golden light, Harper stopped once more. The trees before them parted just enough to reveal an open field, wildflowers dancing in the breeze, their colors vivid and full, as if the world had been waiting for this moment to truly bloom. Harper smiled through tears. "I see it," she whispered. "Not just the field, not just the light, but everything, everything that had come before, everything that was still ahead." She reached down, taking Shadow's paw in her hand, not holding it, just touching. As if to say, "We made it." As if to say, "You can rest now." But Shadow didn't sit. He stood tall beside her, still leading, still watching, still loving, and together they stepped forward into the light.